Rangers were not formed from an existing doctrine of the United States Army, but once brought into real combat, that way of fighting was organized, refined, and applied effectively by the United States. When the United States entered World War II, ground warfare still followed familiar patterns: advance, defense, and prolonged battles to seize and hold terrain. Within that context, British commando raids demonstrated a different approach. Small forces, short missions, hit the objective, then withdraw, instead of being drawn into extended fighting. For the U.S. Army, this did not raise the question of replacing infantry or air power. The goal was more practical: to find ways of fighting that were more efficient, less resource-intensive, and reduced unnecessary losses. That was the environment in which the U.S. Army Rangers emerged, not as a fully formed doctrine, but as a force used to test how missions outside the standard template could be executed. And when the method of fighting changed, the first thing that had to be reconsidered was the Rangers' loadout. The question was simple: to fight that way, what did a Ranger need to carry? In North Africa, late 1942, the Rangers entered the war from the sea. They landed at night in small boats onto coastlines with uncertain defenses, not quiet enough to guarantee silence, but not a full-scale beach assault either. In that moment, the mission was not to defend. It was to get ashore and break through the first layer of resistance. Item 1. M1 Garand plus bayonet. Once the Rangers reached ashore and broke through the first layer of resistance, the mission did not end there. Unlike hit-and-withdraw raids, Rangers were required to hold captured ground for several hours, long enough for follow-on forces to land and take over the area. At this stage, the pressure no longer came from the initial minutes, but from maintaining control of space against reactions coming from multiple directions. This is where the rifle became the backbone of the formation. The M1 Garand filled that role. With longer effective range and the ability to sustain controlled fire, the Garand allowed Rangers to dominate the area around the landing site, keep enemy forces outside dangerous distance, and remain stable during the handover window. The Garand was not the weapon of the landing moment. It was not meant to breach the shoreline or break the first obstacle. But once the mission shifted into temporary position holding, the Garand became the firepower anchor, allowing Rangers to complete their most critical task: holding the ground long enough for the operation to continue. Item 2. Amphibious flotation. During amphibious landings, the soldier had to move from boat to shore while carrying full combat equipment. Waves, deep water, and the weight of weapons created the risk of exhaustion or drowning before the mission even began. The M1926 life preserver belt was carried to solve exactly that problem. When inflated, it allowed the soldier to remain afloat while leaving the boat and approaching the shoreline. The value of this item lay in one thing only: ensuring that Rangers reached the shore with enough strength left to use the rest of their equipment. If they could not reach the shore, every weapon carried became meaningless. Item 3. Bangalore torpedo. After landing, Rangers could not always advance directly. Shorelines were often blocked by barbed wire, anti-landing obstacles, or prepared barriers meant to halt forces at the very edge. The Bangalore torpedo was carried to open passages through these obstacles as quickly as possible. It was slid under wire or barriers, detonated, and created a gap just wide enough for the formation to pass through. The value of the Bangalore was that it prevented the formation from stopping. Every minute stuck at an obstacle meant additional exposure, incoming fire, and delays beyond the planned timeline. Item 4. Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife. Gunfire was not always the correct option. In certain situations, noise alone could derail the mission. The knife was carried to resolve extremely close contact when detection had to be kept minimal. The Fairbairn Sykes knife was not intended for prolonged fighting and did not replace primary weapons. It existed to resolve a specific problem quickly without escalating the situation. Note: during 1942 to 1943, the Rangers did not yet have a formally issued, standardized loadout. They used available infantry equipment while experimenting with short-duration missions. The following items reflect mission logic and training influence, not an official equipment table. Item 5. Demolition explosives. Not every Ranger mission ended in direct combat. In some cases, the objective was simply to render a structure, piece of equipment, or defensive position non-functional. To achieve that quickly, explosives were the most direct solution. When carried, demolition charges were used against specific targets, an artillery piece, a defensive position, or a key structure that did not need to be held. In this loadout, explosives were not considered combat weapons and not used for sustained firepower. They existed for a very short window. Place, detonate, leave the area. Because explosives imposed a weight and mobility cost, they were carried only when the mission explicitly required them. In those missions, explosives were not about winning fights, but about ending the mission as quickly as possible. Item 6. Thompson M1928A1. In some missions, Rangers carried submachine guns to handle the phase between leaving the boat and reaching the shoreline. While the formation was still deploying, positions not yet stable, and rifle fire not fully effective, the priority was immediate close-range firepower. In that context, the Thompson was a practical choice. Its rapid fire in confined spaces applied pressure at first contact, reducing the risk of the formation being stalled in the opening minutes. In this loadout, the Thompson existed as a situational option, not as the Rangers' firepower foundation. Item 7. Sidearm M1911A1. The sidearm was carried as a personal backup option, used when the primary weapon could not be brought into action immediately or in extremely confined spaces. It did not replace the primary weapon and was not intended for prolonged combat. Item 8. Fragmentation grenade. Grenades were carried to quickly resolve obstacles in confined spaces, not for extended engagements, not as a primary weapon, only to create a brief opening when the mission had to continue. Item 9. Load-bearing system. The load-bearing system allowed essential equipment to be carried without restricting movement. Its layout emphasized balance and quick access, supporting fast movement and short contact. It was designed for mission tempo, not long-term endurance. Item 10. Ammunition. Ammunition was carried to match the expected mission duration. There were no reinforcements and no surplus for prolonged fighting. Limited ammunition for strict control over combat tempo. Item 11. Uniform. Standard U.S. Army infantry uniform. Used for availability and familiarity. No Ranger-specific modifications were issued during this period. Item 12. Headgear. Steel helmets were used when protection from fire was required. Cloth caps were used when reduced weight and lower fatigue were prioritized. Both were standard issue. Item 13. Footwear. Standard U.S. infantry boots and gaiters, suitable for short-duration foot movement across varied terrain. No specialized design for special missions. Item 14. Hydration. A minimal amount of water was carried, calculated to sustain strength for a short mission. There was no resupply during execution, so water had to be planned from the start. Item 15. Rations. Lightweight, high-energy food, used only to maintain strength during the mission window, not intended for extended living or occupation. Item 16. Medical. Personal first aid equipment for initial wound treatment, used only to control bleeding temporarily until leaving the area, not for prolonged care. Item 17. Navigation. Used to identify objectives and maintain accurate movement, reduce the risk of disorientation during short, independent operations. Item 18. Signal timing. Used to coordinate formations and control timing of actions. Enabled rapid signaling when verbal communication was not possible. Item 19. Chemical protection. Standard chemical protection cape, designed to protect against gas weapons. No gas attacks occurred, but Rangers were still required to carry it. In practice, it was often used as waterproof lining for foxholes or as improvised rain cover. Item 20. Signature reduction. Used to break up equipment outlines and reduce immediate visual recognition. Not full concealment, only short-term reduction of visibility. Item 21. Toggle rope. Used to cross obstacles or assist movement over difficult terrain. This item reflected Commando training influence and was carried when mission conditions required it. Rangers were not created because infantry had become obsolete. They emerged because war demanded missions that standard infantry was not designed to solve efficiently. In that early period, the Rangers did not have a complete loadout on paper. Every item they carried was retained not because of doctrine, but because it proved useful in a specific mission. The Ranger loadout, therefore, was not invented from nothing. It began with what the U.S. Army observed from British Commando units, then was integrated into American organization, training, and operational conditions. From existing infantry equipment, from methods that were learned, and most importantly, from taking those elements into real missions to test them, adjust them, and discard what no longer worked. Learning does not erase identity. How an army organizes and applies what it has learned is what creates the difference. And that is how the U.S. Army turned an adopted method of fighting into a Ranger loadout that was distinctly its own.